Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Teaching War Fiction, the Red Badge of Courage, a professional development webinar sponsored by the National Humanities Center's America in Class. My name is Richard Schramm. I'm the Vice President for Education Programs here at the Center, and I'll be moderating this evening's session. This webinar tonight is the first of a three-part series on teaching war fiction. The second part will take place a week from tonight on January 28th, and we'll look at All Quiet on the Western Front. And the following week, we'll look at the things they carried. There's still some time to register, still some places open in those webinars, so I encourage you to sign up. They make a really nice package, and these three novels are, of course, widely taught in high schools across the country. Let me tell you a little bit about the National Humanities Center. We're an institute for advanced study located in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. Our main program is a fellowship program that brings scholars from this country and abroad to the center to research and write on topics in the humanities, history, literature and language studies, philosophy, criticism of the arts, that sort of thing. We maintain an active program of outreach to high school teachers, and you can find all of the things we do by going to americainclass.org. You'll land on this page, and from this page you'll be able to get to the rest of our webinars and all of the online resources that we provide for high school teachers. Please check that out. I think you'll find some really valuable resources. You can also check our Pinterest page, and there you will find a rich array of resources that follow American history and literature curricula in the high schools. You will also find an array of resources from places other than the National Humanities Center. It's a really valuable resource, and I urge you to check it out. I also urge you to follow us on Facebook. You do that, and you'll be kept abreast of all the latest developments in the education programs at the Humanities Center, and whenever we issue a new product or post a new webinar schedule, you'll be alerted to it. So follow us on Facebook, keep up with us. I think we can really offer you some great resources and programs to help your teaching. Now, after our seminar this evening, please go back to the Teaching War Fiction Red Badge of Courage website. There you will find a recording of the program, so you'll be able to refer back to it. You'll also find the PowerPoint presentation we'll use tonight, and let me invite you to plunder that presentation for your own classes. That's what it's there for. Take whatever you want from it and use it with your own students. You will also find an evaluation. This is very important to us, so if you'll please fill that out and send it back to us, we will really appreciate it. We pay attention to what you tell us, and we try to improve our programs based on what we learn from the evaluations. Once we have your evaluation, we will send you a letter, an email, documenting your participation in the program, and you'll be able to submit that to your local certifying authority to obtain whatever recertification credit your participation in this webinar warrants. Now, how do you participate? Well, this evening, Eliza Richards, our scholar, will be lecturing and posing questions and having conversation with you. And when she poses a question, we hope you'll answer that by putting your cursor in that long rectangular box, down at the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Type your response, hit that send button to the right, and it will appear in the chat box above. But don't wait for us to pose a question. These webinars work best when we interact with you more. So don't be afraid to ask your own questions or make comments, and give us feedback about how you teach this material. If you see a passage that's usable in class, let us know how you'd present it. If you see a potential project or assignment in the material, share that with us. The golden rule of our webinars is that the more you participate, the better they are. So let's get underway. We're very pleased to have with us tonight as our seminar leader, Eliza Richards, who is Associate Professor of Literature at the University of North Carolina, at Chapel Hill. Eliza was a National Humanities Center Fellow a few years ago. She has published in 2004 Gender and the Poetics of Reception in Poe's Circle, 2013, Emily Dickinson in Context, and before too long, we'll be able to read Correspondent Lines, Poetry and Journalism in the U.S. Civil War. So let me turn Eliza's microphone on and turn the program over to her. Eliza, tell us about the Red Badge of Courage.
Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. We're going to be talking about the Red Badge of Courage tonight, but we'll have some context first. I'll talk a little bit about naturalism in American literature. That's the kind of literature that Red Badge of Courage is supposed to be, is considered to be. And then we'll learn a little bit about Stephen Crane before we turn to interpreting the novel. Can everybody hear me okay? Is this working?
Yeah, I think we can.
Okay.
We haven't got comments otherwise.
It's working. Okay. Good. Good. So naturalism, I'll read this short definition. It describes a type of literature, and it emerged towards the end of the 19th century in the United States, that attempts to apply scientific principles of objectivity and detachment to its study of human beings. Unlike realism, which focuses on literary technique, naturalism implies a philosophical position. For naturalist writers, since human beings are, in Emile Zola's phrase, human beasts, characters can be studied through their relationships to their surroundings. So sociology was a rising science in this time period, and fiction writers came to be interested in sociological concepts and began to study humans the way scientists did. So here's a particularly well-known scholar, what he has to say about naturalism. Reveling in the extraordinary, the excessive, and the grotesque in order to reveal the immutable bestiality of man and nature, naturalism dramatizes the loss of individuality at a physiological level by making a Calvinism without God its determining order and violent death its utopia. So you see, this is a kind of reversal of earlier kinds of, say, romantic fiction, people like Hawthorne, um, who really elevated the idea of the human soul, the human mind, human will. These things are being contrasted and refuted in various ways by naturalist writers, and we see that Crane does that in Red Badge of Courage. So some of the themes of naturalism, and we see a lot of these in Red Badge: survival, determinism, violence, and taboo. The characters are frequently, but not always, ill-educated or lower-class characters whose lives are governed by the forces of heredity, instinct, and passion. And here you see someone who's not terribly well-educated under the exigencies of war. And some of the best known naturalist writers on the American scene are Frank Norris, Jack London, Stephen Crane, who's considered one of the foremost naturalists, Edith Wharton, and Richard Wright. Here's Stephen Crane. He certainly sounds like a naturalist. These are a couple small quotes that sort of sum it up for us. From The Open Boat, a novella or short story, kind of long short story from 1894. He writes, "When it occurs to a man that nature does not regard him as important, and that she feels she would not maim the universe by disposing of him, he at first wishes to throw bricks at the temple, and he hates deeply the fact that there are no bricks and no temples." And then he wrote a small poem. All his poems are very interesting and quite short, to the same effect. A man said to the universe, this is the entire poem, a man said to the universe, "Sir, I exist." "However," replied the universe, "the fact has not created in me a sense of obligation." A little bit about the life of Crane. He's kind of a remarkable writer because he lived to be only 29 years old. So he was incredibly prolific and really gifted for someone of that age. He seems to have known a lot more than someone that age possibly could, and people remarked on how precocious he was. He was born in 1871, well after the Civil War ended, in Newark, New Jersey, and he was the 14th child of a Methodist minister. He attended Syracuse University for just about a year and then quit. He left to become a journalist in New York City. He published his first novel very early, Maggie, a Girl of the Streets, about a prostitute. That novel didn't sell well and didn't do much for him. He was trying to make a name for himself. But in 1895, when he published Red Badge of Courage, the novel made him famous. People remarked on what an unusually talented young writer he was. In the same year, he also published some poems entitled Black Writers and Other Lines. And after the war, it's interesting that he only became a journalist, a war journalist, after he wrote a war novel. So he gained his experience of war, firsthand experience after the Red Badge of Courage, and he covered the Greco-Turkish War and the Spanish-American War. Some of his short stories that teach very well in class, I think. The Bride Comes to Yellow Sky, The Blue Hotel, and The Open Boat. He wrote many other short stories and many novels that unfortunately we don't read as often. In 1897, he was nursed back to health after his he had an episode at sea where he almost drowned. He was nursed back to health by Cora Taylor, who was a prostitute and who became his common-law wife. She was also one of the first female journalists to cover a war, one of the first female war correspondents, and together they covered the Greco-Turkish War for a month or two. They settled in England, and he wrote another book of poems called War is Kind, and died in 1900 of tuberculosis. Red Badge of Courage garnered a lot of reviews, and they were mostly very positive. And here's these 3 reviews I offer give you a sense of what people thought about the book. An English critic said that if Red Badge were altogether a work of the imagination, unbased on personal experience, its realism would be nothing short of a miracle. So he believed that Crane fought in the war, and he had a hard time being convinced that Crane had no war experience. He thought the novel was so realistic. A war veteran, George Wyndham, shared the same idea. He says that Crane stages the drama of war, so to speak, within the mind of one man, and that admits you as to a theater. And that's a very insightful, I think, comment, the way that we see the entire war through the eyes of Henry and through the narrator, who has a kind of conflicted relation to Henry, but we really see the whole war through the eyes of one person. Crane's reportage of the process of flashing images shot through the senses into one brain, combined with the strength and truth of a monodrama with the directness and color of the best narrative prose. And then General Alexander McClurg, who is a member of the armed forces, complained about the book and said it was a vicious satire upon American soldiers and American armies, part of a plot to undermine confidence in the nation's armed forces, because Crane didn't portray the army as heroic and showed some of the bad aspects of war.
Eliza, if I could interject here, looking
Yes.
ahead to next
Yeah,
week's
sure.
webinar, we're going to look briefly at the reviews for All Quiet on the Western Front, and they are remarkably similar to the reviews for Red Badge of Courage. You have people praising its realism, praising the vividness of its portrayal, and then you have also people saying that this is a disgrace, that it is undermining the confidence of the nation's armed forces. And I swear, I think there is a review that uses, if not that language, then language very close to it. And All Quiet on the Western Front was one of the books burned by the Nazis for that very reason. It attacked the Germanic notion of heroism and patriotism. So it's remarkable
Yes.
that these books occasioned the same type of critical response.
Even though they're written like 40 or 50 years apart.
Yeah, Red
Yeah.
Badge is 1895 and All Quiet is 1929.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah. So Crane, this is what Crane says in response to the criticism. He was proud. He said, I have only one pride, and may it be forgiven me. This single pride is that the English edition of the Red Badge has been received with praise by the English reviewers. They have praised it for just what I intended it to be, a psychological portrayal of fear. And that's very interesting because that's quite on target too. We're seeing Henry in a high state of anxiety over the course of a short period of time. They all insist that I'm a veteran of the Civil War, whereas the fact is, as you know, I never smelled even the powder of a sham battle. I know what the psychologists say, that a fellow can't comprehend a condition that he has never experienced. Of course, I've never been in a battle, but I believe that I got my sense of the rage of conflict on the football field, or else fighting is a hereditary instinct, and I wrote intuitively, for the Cranes were a family of fighters in the old days, and in the Revolution every member did his duty.
Eliza, that's an interesting. If we go back for a moment, that's an interesting
Yeah,
passage there because he is when he says there. Um, let's see, or else fighting is a hereditary instinct, and I wrote intuitively. He's suggesting there almost that his own writing is, moved by instinct. I mean, that's a naturalistic writer saying that he is writing naturalistically out of instinctual impulses almost. So he's very thoroughgoing in his naturalism, wouldn't you say?
yes, right. That maybe it's not him writing, maybe it's his bodily heritage
Yeah,
writing for him.
yeah,
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 that's
yeah.
great.
Just as Henry was a hero out of instinct, he's a novelist out of instinct.
Out of instinct, yes, that's great. And people say that he wrote in a kind of bizarre uh, trance-like way, where he just sort of put the pen to the page and didn't pick it up, and just
Hmm.
kept writing as if he were just forming words without thinking. So that's interesting.
Hmm.
So
We
this
have,
is
excuse me, too.
considered.
If I could just interject here, we have some comments that
Sure.
came in through the chat, and
Yeah.
I actually had my chat box in a different location, so I missed these. Um, we have some people commenting on using the author's biographical material. Others talking about if they should have students research the author's life before reading a novel. That's an interesting question, Eliza. What would you recommend
Yeah.
there? Do you think they should
I've
do that?
tried. Yeah, I can see you can. Sometimes the students get bored with that, and
Hmm.
sometimes it excites them. Crane himself, his life was so exciting, and I think the students get interested that he was so young when he started writing and was so successful, that I think his life can be captivating, but it's hard to know how much background and biographical material to give students. And I experiment with giving it at the end or alongside the text in little portions, little sections. Um, it's interesting I ask the students themselves how much they care and how much it matters to have biographical and background material.
Hmm.
So it's a really interesting question.
Well, Pat Marshall makes a really good teaching suggestion here. She says, I've had a lot of luck using soldiers' letters from my state to set the stage for the novel. The letters from the area engage the kids more fully in the story of the soldiers, hence Henry's story. That would be excellent for all of the novels that we're dealing with in this series because um, it would set the context actually for all three of them. The comments are coming in here pretty quickly. I'm keeping up with them. Janet Chandler writes, I've also used primary sources, personal letters that really draw students in. Videos are great. Intuitive writing is definitely interesting, and especially since it was such a success. That's true. Videos again, and the works of Ambrose Bierce can be very illuminating when combined with a unit on Red Badge as well. One day I'd love to do an entire unit on the Civil War. That would be really
Yeah.
interesting if a teacher could fit that into a class. There are lots of really good fictional works from the period. Crazy idea, when they say the trauma can be passed on to the next generation genetically. Maybe we somehow know war from our forebears. Maybe Crane inherited his instinct to write realistically about war. I think it's important in history to validate the source. So using a work of fiction is essential to know the biography of the author. Let me ask our participants, when your students read Red Badge, before you tell them about Crane's life, do they think he was in the war? Do they see this as an autobiographical novel? And maybe you could respond to
Uh,
that while
Right, that's
Eliza is
one
going
interesting
on.
thing to do is to teach it to the students find it really captivating and realistic, and then to let them know that he was born in 18 born after the war ended.
Hmm. Hmm.
He was interested in interviewing veterans, and he was interested in actually getting information about the war himself.
Hmm.
So,
Hmm. And
um,
Theo writes, most assume the author made up the story, so they think that he was not a participant. I know some adults I have talked to were shocked by this information that he wasn't a veteran. Jody writes, I usually tell them he was not to draw attention to his mastering of the craft. It's awesome to think he could write so well. about a moment before his birth. You know, it's interesting. We don't have any record of how veterans of the Civil War, as far as I know, we don't have any record about how veterans of the Civil War responded to Red Badge of Courage. If you look at contemporary fiction, if you look at the things they carried, Vietnam veterans have had very strong opinions about that novel, and I know the fiction that's being written about the Iraq and Afghanistan war has elicited strong opinions from veterans too. So it would be interesting to see if how Civil War veterans responded to Red Badge. Eliza, do you know if there's any documentation on that?
No, I haven't read anything on that, and I have read quite a bit on Red Badge of Courage, so
Yeah,
I don't know of any record of Civil War veterans' responses.
yeah, that would be
So
interesting to
that
know.
is an interesting question. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, shall we move on to the
Okay.
buildings roman?
Onwards. Yeah. Okay. So it Red Badge of Courage does belong to the Bildungsroman genre, and yet it certainly plays with with the expectations of this genre. So it's supposed to be a growing up story, how a boy became a man and a hero. But does the novel really reinforce this expectation? How does it work with the expectation? And how does it trouble that expectation? The central question to the novel really is if Henry becomes a man, and if he becomes a man, does he become a hero? And the significance of the title is important in relation to those questions. So we'll be focusing on that in the slides that follow. And here's the central question. What is Crane's attitude toward the myth of military heroism, toward Henry's conviction at the close that he was a man? It's very important to note how the narrator is different from Henry himself. The narrator often ironizes Henry's thoughts and has a distance from his thoughts. So it's not Henry himself simply thinking. There's an overlay there, and that's where we get the kind of conflicted sense of who Henry is and what how we're supposed to feel about him. So this is the very first passage of the novel. And if we had more time, it would be good to talk about how nature is portrayed throughout the novel. Crane painstakingly describes the natural world in relation to the men throughout, but we're just going to look at this one section to think about that now, as it's the very first opening passage. The cold passed reluctantly from the earth, and the retiring fogs revealed an army stretched out on the hills resting. As the landscape changed from brown to green, the army awakened and began to tremble with eagerness at the noise of rumors. It cast its eyes upon the road, which were growing from long troughs of liquid mud to proper thoroughfares. So the question here is how is the army portrayed? And what is the place of the individual man in the landscape? And why does Crane portray the army in this way? Um, I'll pause. I'd like to get your thoughts on this.
Mhm.
How does he, at the very beginning, portray individual men, men as an army, and how does he portray their relationship to nature?
Okay, we've got these questions on the table. How is the army portrayed, and what is the place of individual men in the landscape, and why does Crane portray the army this way, and what is nature's relation to man? We have an interesting comment here from Jody Hollis, and this is new to me. Crane's sequel to Red Badge and The Veteran. I have to confess, I'm not familiar with that novel. That does
Yeah, he's
sound
got
like it.
a number of other war stories
Yeah,
that are interesting
is the
to
veteran? Is
teach
this Henry?
alongside.
Is the veteran the story of Henry after the war, sort of? I have to plead
Yes.
totally. Maybe we'll do a webinar on the two. Okay, they're often anthologized together. What I've obviously not been looking at the right anthologies. Well, here, let's get back to our questions. How's the army portrayed here? Um, we have a question about Henry being a reliable narrator. I think we'll pick that up later on. But it seems to me
He's
here
not,
to
he's
answer.
really not narrating. Henry isn't the narrator. There's another narrator here. So the question is the narrator a reliable narrator, but Henry himself is not narrating the story.
Mhm. Hmm. Yeah, I think the way the army is portrayed as an organism, as something that's alive. It's anthropomorphized. It's stretched out on a hill. It is resting. It awakens, and it looks. Let's see. It trembles with
It's
eagerness
not
at the noise of
anthropomorphized.
rumors.
It's turned into an animal, right?
Hmm.
Some kind of
Hmm.
strange dragon-like animal, and
Hmm.
that image of dragons. Uh, yeah, someone just said the constant discussion of the army as a monster or dragon is telling. Yeah, what is it telling of? Why aren't they portrayed as individuals and they're portrayed as a kind of a mass that has one brain and one body?
Hmm. Yeah, and its place in nature. It's a part of nature. I mean, it's lying there, stretched out over the hills. It's like any animal in nature. And as nature changes, it's changing. The roads are going from liquid
Yeah.
mud to thoroughfares, and it is waking up. And here we have
Great.
Jerry writes
Yeah.
again. You will lose your individualism in the army, and let's see. Pat Marshall has responded. Um, that General Alexander McClurg, 88th Illinois Infantry, was the one who panned the red badge. His letters to the dial are available online. Well, thank you.
Yeah, and
It's wonderful. We can
that's a
some of
good
these
website.
resources.
The one that you've cited there is a very good website for information about the Red Badge of Courage. So right after that passage that we just read, where the army seems like a big lazy dragon, comes in a certain individual soldier. So there's a real juxtaposition of the individual soldier and the natural world with the massive army that comes before. And I'll read this for you. Once a certain tall soldier developed virtues and went resolutely to wash a shirt. He came flying back from a brook, waving his garment banner-like. He was swelled with a tale he had heard from a reliable friend, who had heard it from a truthful cavalryman, who had heard it from his trustworthy brother, one of the orderlies at division headquarters. He adopted the important air of a herald in red and gold. "We're going to move tomorrow, sure," he said pompously to a group in the company street. "We're going to way up the river, cut across, and come around in behind them." So, what's the relationship between these two passages, and why does Crane switch so suddenly from one way of describing things to another? Why does he use this? He uses juxtaposition quite a bit in the novel. Um,
The beginning here struck me in cinematic terms. I mean, it's like a panning shot where you begin with this distant shot of the army, and then you move in more closely and identify individuals. It's really quite cinematic, remarkable. Okay, the river
right.
bridges these two sections, and I think what we're seeing here now is he's picking out individuals from the army. It could be to show the diversity of the army. People came from all over the place to one unit
They seem a little
different times.
silly too, don't
Yeah.
they? And their perspective is much more narrow than they don't see themselves as part of a larger whole.
Hmm.
They can't see the larger whole. They see their smaller interests, and they're hearing rumors and thinking that rumors are true. Um,
Yeah. And
so
we John notes that the soldiers are a bit childish too, along the same lines that you just
yeah,
raised. We
right.
also
They're
hear
young
be
men, and they act younger than they are, even though they're already quite young.
Yeah, and we also
Yeah,
begin to see here the distance between the narrator and the characters. I mean, the narrator is making fun of them. He was swelled by the tale that he had heard from a reliable friend, who heard it from a truthful cavalryman, who heard it from a trustworthy brother. One of, you know, he's already
yeah,
undercutting. He's undercutting what the characters believe and
yeah.
say.
That's not what the character would say. He would say that earnestly, as if he
Hmm.
had truthful information.
Hmm.
Yeah. And now we move to Henry and what he thinks of the war right at the beginning. He does go through a kind of transformation over the course of the story. And this is Henry early on thinking about war and thinking about why to enlist. He had burned several times to enlist. Tales of great movements shook the land. They might not be distinctly Homeric, but they seemed to be much glory in them. He had read of marches, sieges, conflicts, and he had longed to see it all. His busy mind had drawn for him large pictures, extravagant in color, lurid with breathless deeds. So here we can focus in on the relationship between the narrator and Henry, which is so important. What's the difference in the way that the narrator is telling us what Henry thinks and what Henry thinks? So,
what's the difference?
Yeah, what's the difference between the way the narrator's describing it and what Henry is thinking?
Okay. The difference, Henry, Denise writes that Henry is about to pay for his romanticism. Thea writes this could reveal Henry's motivation to join the army to what he actually experiences. Amelia writes this reminds me so much of several students I have who want to enter the military. Jody writes the narrator must be an adult while Henry is still stuck in the immature romantic view of war. Yeah. And I think go ahead.
Oh, that's a general, you get a sense of they might not be distinctly Homeric.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Henry probably doesn't know what Homeric means, but there seemed to be much glory in them. So the narrator is being ironic and making fun of Henry.
Mm-hmm. And this also establishes the narrator as a fairly erudite and sophisticated person. I mean, he's yes. Definitely sort of stepped back and he's watching these characters under a moment of great stress and duress. I mean, that too is a kind of naturalistic stance, isn't it? I mean, that's the kind of the objective scientist watching these human subjects in a moment, in an environment of great hostility and stress.
Yeah, and it goes back to the idea of naturalism, that the narrator is observing Henry as a kind of sociologist and isn't terribly sympathetic with his own character. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that strikes me, if I may, one of the things that strikes me about this is that if we could go back to that slide for a moment.
The previous slide.
Yeah, the previous one. His motivation here has nothing to do with the cause. It's all glory, marches, siege, conflicts, large, extravagant cause. There's no notion here of what he's really fighting for. There's, we wouldn't know he's a Union soldier unless Crane hadn't told us that the uniforms around him were blue. So patriotism, politics, these traditional constituents of heroism never really enter into Henry's thinking.
That's right. And not throughout the entire novel. He doesn't think about the enemy. He thinks of as they might be nice guys, right? But they're things to fight, and he doesn't think much about what the purpose of the war is. Now we get to the different fights that Henry is in, and Henry has this anxious preoccupation about whether he's going to run or not, and this is one section of that worry that he's just kind of thinking to himself obsessively. There was a more serious problem. He lay in his bunk pondering upon it. He tried to mathematically prove to himself that he would not run from a battle. Previously, he had never felt obliged to wrestle too seriously with this question. In his life, he had taken certain things for granted, never challenging his belief in ultimate success and bothering little about means and ends. That's a typo. But here he was confronted with a thing of moment. It had suddenly appeared to him that perhaps in a battle he might run. He was forced to admit that as far as war was concerned, he knew nothing of himself. So why... the question is, why doesn't he know whether he can run or not? Can't people just choose to run or to stay put? Why doesn't mathematics solve his problem to him? What is the human problem he's confronted with? Why can't he just choose not to run and choose to be brave? And this is important for the way the novel works and the points it's trying to make.
Okay, well, what do we make of this passage? Let's see. Theo writes mathematics doesn't involve emotion. When you take feeling into account, it becomes subjective, which math is not. Ms. Stevens writes, sounds like Yossarian from Catch-22. Jody, is this a question of heart? Do we know what our heart truly is? The more brave you are, the more opportunities you give the enemy to kill you. It's a very simple question with incredibly convoluted lines of response. Problem is natural instincts tend to take over under duress. You cannot
Yeah,
run.
instinct's important.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Hmm.
instinct's
You cannot
important.
run in battle unless you buy your squad leader or CO. Let's see, we have more comments here. Again, let me see, my chat is jumping around here. I don't think anyone knows how they would respond in battle, and he's hit with reality. Yeah, this seems to be one of the few times that he really stares at himself and comes up with an honest assessment of himself. He was forced to admit that as far as war was concerned, he knew nothing of himself.
Yeah,
And the novel, in one way, is his attempt to learn about himself. And he
to
never,
learn what he will do under different circumstances. Yeah,
yeah, and
he's a lab experiment in that way.
yeah, he is.
He himself is an experiment.
Hmm.
And and what does he do in the first battle? I don't think we oh, yeah, and what does he do in the first battle? He doesn't run, and he gets all excited and thinks that he has proven that he will not run in battles with his first experience where he stays put and fights. And this is what he thinks after he stays put and fights. He went into an ecstasy of self-satisfaction. He had the most delightful sensations of his life. Standing as if apart from himself, he viewed that last scene. He perceived that the man who had fought thus was magnificent. So, does he merit his own admiration? I think it's clear that that no, he doesn't. We've read the whole novel, but where are these feelings coming from? I guess more importantly, why is he so? Where is he getting this feeling that he's so amazing?
Where would he be getting that feeling that he is so amazing? Um, and we have a question here about the poetry we'll be teaching with All Quiet, and we're actually not going to consider any poetry with that novel. We're just going to be looking at the novel itself. Let's see. Any comments on where this comes? I think from his own, the fantasies he's had, the illusions he's had about war, and he comes through his first battle, which is a fairly minor skirmish. He comes through feeling pretty good about himself. So it's a
Yeah.
combination of that first survival moment plus his illusions about war. We have a really good question here, though. Let me see if I can find it again in the chat. Charity writes, would naturalists argue that flight is natural and that bravery is a human notion that leads to death? So how do you think the naturalist writers would see bravery?
Yeah.
Is that artificial, or is
I,
that
I think
is that
if
natural?
we move to the next slide, I think we can get into that question in more detail because I think that's a really important question because he does run the second time. You would think he ran the first time and then he wouldn't run the second time, but it's reversed, which suggests that it isn't up to him whether he runs or not. So let's read this passage and then think about this idea of naturalism and what it would mean to run or to stay put. Um, Others began to scamper away through the smoke. The youth turned his head, shaken from his trance by this movement as if the regiment was leaving him behind. He saw the few fleeting forms. He yelled them with fright and swung about. For a moment in the great clamor he was like a proverbial chicken. He lost the direction of safety. Destruction threatened him from all points. Directly he began to speed toward the rear in great leaps. His rifle and cap were gone. His unbuttoned coat bulged in the wind. The flap of his cartridge box bobbed wildly, and his canteen by its slender cord swung out behind. On his face was all the horror of those things which he imagined. So the question is, why does he run this time when he had no problem fighting just a few minutes before? And what is governing his decision? Is it his character, his personality, or is it his body that's governing what he does? Does he have a personality? What makes him run here when he stayed put the previous time?
Okay, it's a good question. What what makes him run? Why do we think? We've had some comments here about Sebastian Junger talking about Americans and their love of war, and young men needing to prove themselves in war. He runs because he is part of a unit that is running. Let's see. What else do we
Would the
have?
naturalist say it was physical rather than character? I would say yes. It's a physiological response.
Hmm.
He's uh, it's combined with cognition, right? The things that he's absorbing and thinking about. But it's almost like he runs before he thinks, not
Hmm.
that he thinks and then he runs.
Hmm.
Um, so there, Crane and naturalists are giving a great this idea that the human is a beast. They're giving a lot more weight to physiological response, and yeah, the brain is tied to the body in a much more powerful way. The brain can't decide everything all by itself. Um, so
Hmm. I think we have an interesting comment here. Reality comes through. This could be his mortality. His adrenaline is gone. So yeah, maybe after that first bout of combat, um, he's the adrenaline has receded and it's not ready to come back for as quickly as it might, because the second battle comes pretty fast on the heels of the first, if I remember correctly.
right,
Is that not correct? Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. We have a comment here from Janet Chandler. She's a social studies teacher, so she wants to use books as a way to show the emotions of war, the human response to war, what is the myth of war versus reality of war, so to find passages that shows what war really is, horrible and violent. Well, certainly in this book, but really in the next two, you get into even more naturalistic depictions of war. This
yeah.
one, it struck me, if we could focus on that for a moment, I think we're going to have time to take these digressions. What about the depictions of battle and the depictions of people being killed? I know we have descriptions of people writhing on the ground, but when you compare them to what we're going to see next week and the following week, these are fairly tame and almost bloodless descriptions of battle. Would you
Yeah,
and wounds and death? Would you say that's the case, Eliza?
that this has bloodless descriptions of battle.
Well, they're not. They're. It's. You don't. You. I found
He
myself not
focuses,
being
yeah,
terribly
he
moved by
focuses
them.
on the individual corpse. I think
Hmm.
the descriptions are quite horrific of encountering death, but
Hmm.
Henry's encountering death in terms of the individual corpse usually. I want to say something in what I'm also reading the transcript of the comments, and a couple people have said Henry's part of the organism, and that's why he runs. And I think that's important
Yeah.
too. Um, he 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 sees other people running, so he runs, and that makes him less of an individual and more of part of a larger thing. So
Hmm.
while he may think he's an individual, he's also acting like part of a larger organism, the kind of organism we saw right at the beginning of the novel in the first passage. So
Right.
it's really,
Right. Well, Jody, in response to my comments, she mentions not the one description of the man leaning against a tree. Wasn't he missing a limb? Yeah. There's he was missing a limb, and there are plenty of descriptions of death. But I think we'll see in the next two novels that those authors really focus on death. They really meditate upon it. I mean, you've got in All Quiet. It opens in the early part of the novel. You have a group of men uh, standing around the bed of a man who is dying, watching him die. And then in Things They Carried, for example, when the narrator replays at several points in the book the moment he killed someone else and the moment one of his
yeah,
comrades in arms dies from a landmine. So they're much more brutal and they're much more
right.
prominent. So is this just a is this just an evolution of realism? How would you account for the changes in the depiction of battle
Yeah, I think that's
and death?
it's an interesting question. It is true that that novels become more graphic as they move
Hmm.
forward. Um, the photographs of the Civil War are far more. It's not that people didn't realize the carnage. The U.S. Civil War was the first war where mass death figured as a kind of central
Hmm.
experience of the war. So people were very highly aware of that. But it's true that Crane's depiction just isn't. It isn't gruesome.
Hmm.
I wouldn't say it's not gruesome. It's gruesome on the individual level. Henry is fascinated with individual corpses because he's encountering them as a kind of mirror for himself. But
Hmm.
it's an interesting question why there's no depictions of mass death.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, if that scene, the scene where he is after he's run away and he's sort of in the woods and he comes upon that skeleton that's embedded in the ground.
yeah.
There, you do have a kind of meditation on death. But as Pat Marshall points out here, his writing on these scenes is more lyrical than it is graphic. Would you say that's correct, Eliza?
Yeah, that seems right to me. Um, yeah, I think that
Hmm.
seems right. There are moments of horror where Jim Conklin is wandering around in the field trying to find a way to die.
Hmm.
And the moment in the ants crawling over the yellow face of the man in
Hmm.
the woods. Um, Maybe they're kind of a gothic lyric
Yeah.
style. So yeah, they're not beautiful, I would say,
Oh no.
but I think it's interesting to call them lyrical. Yeah.
Yeah, and that
Um,
scene with the skeleton in the forest with the forest growing over it and so forth. That's a naturalistic exclamation point there. You know, man is part of nature. We're going to be resolved into dust. What is this battle for? Because nature is going to swallow us up in the end anyway. So that's a
yeah.
very strong naturalistic punctuation to the entire novel.
Yeah. So here we reach this key moment where Henry gets his red badge of courage that's tagged very heavily by the fact that that's the title of the book. And remember that he gets it in a in an illegitimate way by a soldier while he's just run away from a battle, hitting him in the head with the butt of a gun. So here's the before and after of Henry thinking about the red badge of courage that he about receiving a red badge of courage, a wound. Um, at times he regarded the wounded soldiers in an envious way. He conceived persons with torn bodies to be peculiarly happy. He wished that he too had a wound, a red badge of courage. And then after he gets the wound, so staggering before the loud soldier, he began, "Yes, yes, I've had an awful time. I've been all over, way over on the right. Terrible fighting over there. I had an awful time. I got separated from the regiment. Over on the right I got shot in the head. I never seen such fighting. Awful time. I don't see how I could have got separated from the regiment. I got shot too." So the question is, why does he make this up? Why is he lying? Does he seem to feel guilty? Um, and why do you think this is the moment that Crane takes to use as the title for his book, The Red Badge of Courage?
Okay, well, Terry knows that the title is ironic, and it certainly is. Why is he lying about this? And does he feel any guilt at this moment? See what our participants writing. We've got multiple attendees responding. We'll just wait to see what comes. Symbolically, he seems to be telling the truth, though I think he does feel some guilt. It's interesting that he really makes it a point in those few lines to repeat that he's been shot. Let's see, how many times does he say that? He says it, what, twice? I got shot,
Twice.
and then I got shot, and then he repeats awful fighting a couple of times as well. This is one of the major points where he truly loses his romantic view of war. I'm not so sure about that. Let's
Yeah,
think
he
about
doesn't he
that.
seem to be acting like a romantic hero? That even though he's not one, he's playing the drama of someone who's been shot and who has suffered, even though he hasn't experienced the things that he's claiming to have experienced. So in some way, he seems to be enacting a romantic role.
Uh-huh.
To me,
Uh,
that's my impression.
okay. Amelia writes, I live in a large military population. I would compare that envy of the wound to the division between injured soldiers and soldiers who've come back with mental afflictions like PTSD. I've heard several soldiers say that it would be easier if they'd had a physical wound. Uh, Denise writes, but he did experience terrible fighting within himself. Robert writes, his reputation among members of his regiment is an internal struggle through the entire novel. He feels a bit of guilt, but notice, too, that the man who attends to his wound basically ignores, where was I? My chat is
It doesn't look like a bullet wound.
That it doesn't
Yeah,
look
that's
like
a great point.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
And then
really
earlier,
important that he's so focused outward. He cares. His identity is really based on what other people think about him, right?
Mhm.
That's what he really is concerned about, whether people see him run, whether people admire his courage. So this question of whether his identity is forged internally, whether it matters to him, whether he how he received his red badge of courage, or if it only matters what other people think about him.
hmm hmm Yeah, I think if we could go back for a moment to the comment Jody Hollis made about this is where he truly loses his romantic view of war, and we could think about that, because one of the questions I think we'll want to explore at the end of the webinar is whether or not Henry grows emotionally. Now, this novel, how many days does this novel cover? It's only 2 or 3 days, isn't that right? It's a very brief time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's not long. I haven't counted the days, but it might be 3 days.
Yeah, I think it's something like 3 days. And that's another difference between the two novels we're going to look at in the upcoming weeks. All Quiet on the Western Front chronicles the war experience of a group of men who know each other from 1916 through 1918, and then the things they carried covers the combat stint of 1 year. So you see people over time dealing with battle for a longer time than we see Henry, and I think that may be something worthwhile to think about when we talk about Henry at the end of the novel. He doesn't seem to feel any guilt here, but I think later on he might.
Yeah, we get a little bit of guilt somewhere. Later, we're going to look at a passage where he feels some guilt. So here he's continuing to think. Yeah, did you?
We have a real somebody very attuned to symbols here. Denise writes, so does his 3-day journey carry an archetypal symbolism with it? I don't think so. And it may not be 3 days.
I'm just trying to read symbols. There's the famous, most famous archetypal symbol in the book is the red sun was pasted in the sky like a wafer, and a lot of ink has been spilled on that image. But I don't know that it's 3 days. We'd have to be more careful about that before we committed to the symbolism.
Yeah, that's true.
So here we start thinking about the way he's thinking about what makes him a man, whether it's what he thinks of himself or what others think of him. Now that nobody knows that he wasn't shot, he continues to think about that and justify himself. His self-pride was now entirely restored. In the shade of its flourishing growth, he stood with braced and self-confident legs, and since nothing could now be discovered, he did not shrink from an encounter with the eyes of judges, and allowed no thoughts of his own to keep him from an attitude of manfulness. He had performed his mistakes in the dark, so he was still a man. So it's this, I guess, is this enough to be judged from the outside as a man? Do you think it really is enough for Henry? Are there signs that maybe it's not enough for him? Is he really no longer ashamed, and has he found a solution for his problem of not receiving a real wound?
Well, while our participants are wrestling with that, let me read this comment from Robert Dominic, a very insightful comment. There's a point where he stops talking about the enemy as a dragon and using machinery imagery, but then he picks it back up in the later chapters. This perhaps implies that his romantic view of warfare never fades. I think we're going to pick that up at the end of the novel in that last scene as well. But yeah, this This notion of being a man, is it something internal to you, or is it depend upon the way other people perceive you? That also has implications for heroism. And I'd like us to talk about this novel's definition of heroism to some extent too, because that will be a theme in the other two seminars that we'll be doing in this series.
Right.
Why is he no longer ashamed? Do we have any takers for that question? And has Henry found a solution to the problem of his running away? Let's see what our participants have to say about that. We've got some things coming through. Let's see what we've got.
Yeah, I don't know. It seems to me that he actually hasn't solved his problem. I wonder what other people think, but because he keeps obsessing about it, that suggests that he really hasn't come to terms with the fact that he is lying. On some level, he has to keep justifying himself over and over and over again, and that suggests a sense of inadequacy that he's not willing to confront. But I wonder what other people think.
Well, Amelia writes, I think he is still ashamed. This is more about the fact that his shame, at least, isn't public. He performed his mistakes in the dark. He is like a child who got away with something. That's a good insight. Metaphorical darkness is the great eraser of all the sins we think we commit in our minds. Very good points. Some really insightful comments here. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And this is he's still, like I said, he's still trying to justify himself, and he spent a lot of time trying to justify himself, which suggests it's not that easy. And he's still thinking about running away. He remembered how some of the men had run from the battle. As he recalled their terror-struck faces, he felt a scorn for them. They had surely been more fleet and more wild than was absolutely necessary. They were weak mortals. As for himself, he had fled with discretion and I can't help but laugh. As for himself, he had fled with discretion and dignity. So is his justification convincing to you? And I guess next, do we need to condemn him because he keeps making excuses for himself, or is this somehow understandably human?
How about our responses to those questions? He's a kid in battle for the first time. It's human, and no, his reasoning isn't convincing. And it seems as though Henry never really comes to terms with his own behavior and choices versus his own romantic idea of acting heroic. You know, it occurs to me that this novel is, in one sense, a very psychological novel because it traces the ebb and flow of Henry's thought. At one moment, he is condemning himself, and the next moment, he's a hero. Is there any record of Crane reading in psychology of the times? Does this novel reflect psychologiable science of the day?
People don't know a lot about what Crane read. You know, he lived for such a short time, and he actually, there's a lot of things that people ponder whether he read, and there's no evidence that he read them. So, and he didn't have a large library until later on in his life. Right, because he wrote this when he had no money, and he was in his early 20s, so it's dubious.
Yeah, well, we did
a lot of psychology.
We did a webinar last fall on Kate Chopin's The Awakening, and the scholar there presented that as a naturalistic novel, and I have to say I had never quite thought of it that way before, and that was informed by the psychology of the age, and Chopin had read that psychology. So I was wondering if Crane had done any reading along those lines. Yeah,
it's a good question. People don't know much about his reading. They don't know much about his reading at the time of the Red Badge of Courage. So they know that he read, I can't remember the name of the book, but he read a big long history on the Civil War. But that's the book that gets cited in relation to the Red Badge of Courage.
And Ryan Bischoff writes, we have to understand the identity of the U.S. male during the time the book was written. We can't use the identity of U.S. citizens in the 21st century to understand that. That's true. We do have to think about the nature of men at that time, but I wonder how different they are. I mean, Henry's naivete and his youthfulness seem to ring fairly true. I think one of our participants earlier said that Henry reminded her of some of the young men in her classes who were eager to join the military. And that may be one of the reasons we still read this book, because Henry does speak to us across the ages. Would that be fair to say, do you think, Eliza?
Yeah, I mean, I personally identify with the struggle he's going through to justify himself. He and someone in the line said he's a kid, and that's important too. He's a very young man, like maybe he's 17 or 18 years old, and he's
Hmm.
busy growing up. So I think the processes he goes through to justify himself um, are painfully familiar, though maybe we wouldn't like to think so. I think I've gone through these processes myself,
Uh-huh.
so I recognize them. But so I don't find them that alien, but others may. Um,
Hmm.
so after he runs away, then he actually manages to become a hero. And the question is how? Is it through an act of will or is it an automatic act, the way these other things seem to have been automatic? And he's trying to think through why he was a hero in his second fight um, when he ran away the time before. These incidents made the youth ponder. It was revealed to him that he had been a barbarian, a beast. He had fought like a pagan who defends his religion. Regarding it, he saw that it was fine, wild, and in some ways easy. He had been a tremendous figure, no doubt. By this struggle he had overcome obstacles which he had admitted to be mountains. They had fallen like paper peaks, and he was now what he called a hero. And he had not been aware of the process. He had slept, and awakening found himself a knight. So he certainly did perform well in that battle. Does that mean that he is now a hero? And if so, what has made him a hero? And what kind of hero is he? He's calling himself a barbarian and a beast, and yet he seems to think he's a hero now. And has he gained an accurate perception of himself? Is this the end of the road in a way? Has he finally achieved what he was seeking to achieve, which is kind of courage under fire?
Hmm. Well, how do we respond to those questions? We have some comments from our participants, but I want to bring this comment in from Ryan Bishop. It's a comment that really, I think, is worth considering. I was an eager young man who joined. Again, my chat jumped on me. An eager young man who joined the military to fight. I'm now retired. I see an ill-trained soldier with questionable leadership. This was common during the Civil War, and that
It
those
certainly
themes
was.
of uh, poor training and questionable leadership will come up again in All Quiet on the Western Front, because one of the our scholar is going to argue that one of the myths well, one of the themes that novel takes up is the young lions being led by donkeys. The First World War, writing in the First World War, was highly critical, and probably with good reason, of the military
Yeah.
leadership that the soldiers on both sides had.
Yeah, and
So that's a theme
it's
we're
a
going to
theme
trace through
here.
there. Hmm.
Yeah, and here too, you do see these, and it's true that in the Civil War, a lot of the soldiers weren't well trained. They were just simply men who enlisted who had almost next to no training, and and you see hints of that ineptitude throughout Red Badge. So I think that's in the novel for sure. This
Hmm.
idea that he's not being terribly well guided by his superiors. So
Yeah,
that's great.
and that's a theme also in the things they carried, because the lieutenant, if you recall in those stories, at one point he sets them up on a riverbank that is actually a latrine, and that causes the death of one of the characters and leaves the soldiers exposed. So there is that theme running through the things they carried as well. So that seems to be a theme, at least in the three war pieces of war fiction that we're studying here. Okay,
Yes.
so let's go back to our question of has he self-anointed himself as a hero? Um, let's see. He is a hero. He made himself a hero by overcoming obstacles and facing war. And we have a question: how would being both a beast and a knight fit into the naturalistic philosophical view? That's a good
Yeah, that
question,
word
Eliza. How would
beast
you
came up
respond?
again.
Mhm.
It's interesting that the word beast appears here, just as it did in one of the descriptions of naturalism. And it's funny. I think the narrator is making a point by combining beast with knight. And it's a great question. If you need to become a beast in order to fight the way that Henry did, um, then in what way can a beast be a hero? There was an automatic way which Henry kept firing and sort of lost himself to the fight. So, uh, does that fit the definition of heroism? I guess, and so that question raises that issue.
Yeah, and that we will see in upcoming slides the question of whether heroism is an internal trait or something that is perceived by the public. Who really gets to anoint somebody as a hero, the public or uh, the individual himself?
Yeah. So, and in this next slide, it's the first time that Henry actually seems to care about another person. I mean, he cares a bit for Jim Conklin, remember when
Mhm.
he's dying? Um, and that seems to be about it. And then there's this moment when they scuffle over the flag, and he seems to care for another person's well-being. And it's striking that that doesn't happen anywhere else in the novel. So I'll read this passage. The youth and his friend had a small scuffle over the flag. Give it to me. No, let me keep it. Each felt satisfied with the other's possession of it, but each felt bound to declare by an offer to carry the emblem his willingness to further risk himself. The youth roughly pushed his friend away. So, is this a time when he's being altruistic? Is this an image of altruism that he actually caring for another person above himself, which might be part of a definition of heroism, that you care for others more than you care for yourself? Or is something else going on here?
Okay, what's going on in this scene? Why does he want that flag? Does he want to protect his comrade, or does he want it for some other reason? We have some people typing in. Um, yeah, one of the things that struck me about this novel, in comparison to the other ones we're going to be looking at, is that the theme of male camaraderie doesn't loom large here. Um, Henry bounces from one group of soldiers to another on his way back to his regiment, and he forms quick, brief relationships with other guys, but not anything like the bond you see in All Quiet on the Western Front or in the
Yeah.
things they carry.
There's
Very
very
much
little
a
male bonding. He's very
yeah,
much alone throughout
yeah,
the whole thing. Um,
yeah.
and
So we
there's very few images of men bonding in all of Red Badge of Courage.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so we have some responses. Heroism and selfishness might make you dead and others around you dead. And then the flag means glory, right? So I think perhaps Jody is suggesting that this really isn't a desire on Henry's part to protect his comrade, but rather to shower himself in glory. And you remember, in other times when he's talking about his own glory, he uses all sorts of color imagery. And then if we go back to the beginning of the novel, when the soldier is running with the news, he's waving his shirt like a banner. So it's associating the flag with glory as well. So maybe this is Henry's attempt to to literally cover himself with glory. Robert writes, the struggle between Henry and Wilson always seems to me like a fight to figure out who would assume the bigger risk in battle, as the
Yeah.
flag bearer is usually right in front. It's also one of the biggest things in Civil War battles, the capture of the other unit's flag. This was a big deal, and we see
It
that
was a
it
very big
is.
deal. Yeah, it was a
Yeah.
great. These comments are right that
Mhm.
the flag was really important. Keeping the flag, um, keeping your own flag high and not letting it get taken, and taking the other person's flag. Yeah.
Mhm.
So I
And
like this
right.
idea that really what they're fighting for is who's going to be the most covered in glory, which still doesn't get to what we think of as heroism.
Right. Well, Ryan writes, it was very important for the regiment to keep their colors in battle, and it was honorable
Yes,
for a soldier to preserve the flag. Okay.
yes, yes. So now we reach the very end of the novel, and it's such an important part of the novel that we're going to dwell on it a bit in detail. Um, so I'll read. There are two slides, or there are three slides. Three slides, and this is just the very end. We're reading carefully the very end of the novel to think about this question of whether Henry has whether Henry has grown and how he has grown, if he has learned something from his experiences and what he's learned. He's still thinking to himself. He can't stop thinking, and he's thinking about all the things that have happened to him thus far. Later, he began to study his deeds, his failures, and his achievements. Thus, fresh from scenes where many of his usual machines of reflection had been idle, from where he had proceeded sheep-like, he struggled to marshal all his acts. At last they marched before him clearly. From this present viewpoint, he was enabled to look upon them in spectator fashion and criticize them with some correctness, for his new condition had already defeated certain sympathies. Regarding his procession of memory, he felt gleeful and unregretting, for in it his public deeds were paraded in great and shining prominence. These performances, which had been witnessed by his fellows, marched now in wide purple and gold, having various deflections. They went gaily with music. It was pleasure to watch these things. He spent delightful minutes viewing the gilded images of memory. He saw that he was good. He recalled with a thrill of joy the respectful comments of his fellows upon his conduct. So has Henry finally achieved an accurate view of himself? Is he being honest with himself here? He considers only his public deeds. Do they make him a hero? Is heroism a private internal quality of character, or is it a matter of public perception?
What do we think here? Is he being honest with himself? And how does he define heroism? We have some folks typing in. In the meantime, Ryan has pointed out that the flag was actually served a practical purpose. It was a way for a regiment to see where they were going when you were surrounded by smoke.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, that was. Yeah, I had heard that, but I wasn't sure. But that's good to know. Okay, is he being honest with himself here? He's defensive. I see him as like a defensive back in football. You can't dwell on the one touchdown pass you gave up. You can only dwell on when you broke up a pass. So, yeah, that's a good point. He's being human here. He's trying to live with himself.
He's trying to look at what. So that's interesting. He's looking at what he did well and forgetting or not noting what he didn't do well, because it's important not to dwell on the negative.
Yeah,
that's a good
power of
point.
positive thinking. He was several decades ahead of was it Norman Vincent Peale, I think, or no, Dale Carnegie in The Power of Positive Thinking. Okay, but he's considering only his public deeds. Is heroism private internal quality, or is it a matter of public perception? We signal heroes by giving them medals, bright things you can see. So maybe Henry really is a hero. And at one point, one of his he's told that one of his officers praised him among the mule drivers who made up his regiment. He was not one of the mule drivers or mud diggers. He was brave.
Right.
Yeah, this is a nice way to put it. Amelia Philbrook writes, "I love the line. He saw that he was good, like he wasn't sure." And the narrator talks about him going back home and regaling people in his town with tales of heroism. By good, he thinks he means acceptable in the eyes of others. As a naturalist, does Crane believe in heroes? That is a good question. Maybe we could reserve that question until the end. Yeah, maybe we could reserve that question until the end. Let's hang on to that one.
Right. Yeah, that's great.
It could be both, but I think to a large extent heroism is public perception. Many true heroes don't think what they've accomplished was heroic, but rather a sense of duty. Um, Let me see, my chat jumped again. Um, Let me get to the right spot here. Even though I don't know what heroism is, every person I see who is considered a hero, from the Medal of Honor to a person who saves a cat from a tree, does not want to be considered a hero. The public craves them.
Yeah, and that's
Yeah,
interesting because Henry here is the one who really wants to be, he really wants to be a hero, right? That's
uh-huh.
been his goal and his hope all the way along. And he's still trying to prove it to himself. I like this idea that he saw that he was good suggests that he's not so sure. And I think there's, you see the irony or the unsureness of the narrator when he says that Henry spent delightful minutes viewing the gilded images of memory. When images are gilded, when anything is gilded, that means it has it's not solid, right? When
Hmm.
a sword is gilded, that means it's gold on the outside and has another cheaper metal on
Yeah.
the inside. So the gilded images of memory suggest that they are um, that he's embellishing them and they're not entirely true.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
so he seems to still be trying to convince himself that he's a hero, but it's not enough that everybody looks at him that way. But it's a question of, is there something more than having other people view you in that way? So
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah,
um,
and I think the point made earlier that a person who saves, heroes do not consider themselves that way. The public
yeah,
craves them, and I found
right.
that to be. I don't. I have never met a Medal of Honor winner, but from what you see in the news, they all do seem to be very self-effacing people.
Yeah, yeah. And here is a moment when he looks at what um, he actually acknowledges the things that aren't heroic in any way. And let's look at what he thinks about them. For a time, this pursuing recollection of the tattered man. Remember when he's wandering with the tattered man in the field, and then he doesn't help the man. Took all elation from the youth's veins. He saw his vivid error, and he was afraid that it would stand before him all his life. He took no share in the chatter of his comrades, nor did he look at them or know them, save when he felt sudden suspicion that they were seeing his thoughts and scrutinizing each detail of the scene with the tattered soldier. Yet gradually he mustered force to put the sin at a distance, and at last his eyes seemed to open to some new ways. He found that he could look back upon the brass and bombast of his earlier Gospels and see them truly. He was gleeful when he discovered that he now despised them.
Hmm.
So, how does he handle the realization of his sin? He identifies his sin as this occasion with the tattered soldier. And what does his attitude towards this newfound self knowledge suggest about his emotional growth? Has he grown emotionally? Has he recognized his sin and come to terms with it?
How do we respond to those questions? So he has a brief moment when he is thinking about the tattered man, and he can't participate in the chatter of his comrades because he thinks they're talking about him. Yet he gradually mustered force to put the sin at a distance, and at last his eyes seemed to open on some new ways. He seems to do that very easily, Eliza. He's not going through a dark night of the soul here.
No.
The way
And
the narrator just he mustered force to put the sin at a distance. That's pretty quick.
yeah. And what does it mean to put a sin? He doesn't say that he has accepted his sin or that he
Yeah.
has come to terms or he's grappling with his sin. He
Hmm.
puts it away from him at a
Hmm.
distance. And
Yeah.
that's not what one does with a sin if one is taking it seriously. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And we have some comments coming in. Let's see what our participants say. Um, Spies is something pretty strong to just discover too. Yes. And we have
Despise
some
something
other.
pretty strong. Just yes, yes.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah. That's true. I
and this is
despise them, and it's pretty quick.
despises something, yeah, pretty strong to just discover. Yeah, that's a good point um, that he's changed so quickly and so completely because he's eager. He's so eager to be something, and the suggestion is that he's eager to be something that he still is not.
Hmm.
Right.
Hmm. Hmm.
The big question is whether the end is sincere or not, whether Henry has become a man and a hero or not. And some people argue that he has, and a lot of people argue that he hasn't. Um, and this is the very last section. It's missing the last sentence that Richard will read to you. We cut off the last sentence. But let me read. This is the last part of the novel. Let's see what we think about where Henry is at this final point. With this conviction came a store of assurance. He felt a quiet manhood, non-assertive, but of sturdy and strong blood. He knew that he would no more quail before his guides wherever they should point. He had been to touch the great death, and found that after all it was but the great death. He was a man. So it came to pass that as he trudged from the place of blood and wrath, his soul changed. He came from hot plowshares to prospects of clover tranquillity, and it was as if hot plowshares were not. Scars faded as flowers. It rained. The procession of weary soldiers became a bedraggled train, despondent and muttering, marching with churning effort in a trough of liquid brown mud under a low, wretched sky. Yet the youth smiled, for he saw that the world was a world for him, though many discovered it to be made of oaths and walking sticks. He had rid himself of the red sickness of battle. The sultry nightmare was in the past. He had been an animal, blistered and sweating in the heat and pain of war. He turned now with a lover's thirst to images of tranquil skies, fresh meadows, cool brooks, an existence of soft and eternal peace.
And the last line: over the rain, a golden ray of sun came through the hosts of leaden rain. Oh, I blew that. Excuse me. Over the river, a golden ray of sun came through the hosts of leaden rain clouds. So the sun is rising on the youth.
Great, thank you. So, how do we construe this? Is it sincere? Is it tongue in cheek? Um, has Henry become a man? Um, or is there some kind of mockery to that idea here?
We've got some interesting comments here. Rain equals baptism. He is figuratively a new man. War has transformed him. It's a bit tongue in cheek. That's also poetic. It follows the narrator's often sarcastic tone toward Henry. After staring death in the face, I would hope that that one would grow up. More comments. I think it
One
is
would hope.
sincere, but it's an unrealistic, romantic view of manhood. And let's see what else we have coming in.
Those are very interesting comments. Yeah.
Yeah, I can see. I don't know if this novel is taught much anymore, but and I gather from our participants here that they teach it. How do your students view Henry at the end of the novel? Do they see him as a hero, or do they see him as a fraud? It might all depend on how he acts in the next battle. I think that's very telling. Sheer dumb luck. I am lucky. Does that make him a hero? And
I like this idea that it might depend on how he acts in the next battle. What that raises is that he's having this image of scars fading as flowers and a return to the natural world, even though he's marching along to his next battle. So this is
yeah.
just a moment, like any other moment. Um,
Hmm.
it makes it sound like he's going home to start a farm or something like that,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
that's not what's going to happen to him next. So that's
Yeah.
interesting.
It's interesting that the novel starts with the army at rest and ends with the army marching, and he is
Yeah,
going on to his next battle. So this is dynamic. I think what Crane is saying there is this is not the last time Henry is going to try to judge himself. There is another battle, and then another one after that, and if he's lucky, several more that he finally gets through and does go home to his farm. Um,
yeah,
so let's see. We've got some people. He lasted a long time in the war. He either becomes a great soldier or he ran a heck of a lot. He has a thirst for images of tranquil skies that isn't concrete and real. We're finishing the novel tomorrow. At this point, the word they use most often for Henry is flawed. This is students. Oh, very good. But he's also young, and they never let me forget that. He is a bit like Holden Caulfield, always willing to be able to cover up and boisterous about his successes. That is a comparison that never came to me. That's really good. I
yeah.
think that's an
That's great.
excellent way to present Henry, kind of a Civil War version of Holden. Wow. Like all teens. Yes, we have to remember that we're teaching this to what, 15, 16-year-olds? Yeah, yeah. Really good insights from our teachers and students.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yep, great.
So,
Someone said, oh yeah, go ahead, Richard.
well, go on. No, no, go on. I was just going to go back to our question about does Crane believe in heroes, but we can come back to that. Go. What were you going to say, Eliza?
Does I would say, and I don't know if it's just based on Red Badge of Courage, that he does believe in heroism. I don't think he thinks Henry is a hero but I don't think he's exactly judging Henry for not being a
Mm-hmm.
hero. But
Mm-hmm.
he has other pieces, other stories where it's clear to me that he does believe in this in comradeship and heroism and the and people rising above their circumstances to behave in an extraordinary way. But
Mm-hmm.
and you do see that here with Jim Conklin a bit, don't you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
You see moments of people behaving with empathy and care towards others. It's just Henry does not behave that way here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's see. We have some other comments. Jody Haas writes, it would have been awesome if Henry wore a red hunting cap in battle. Yes, and probably backwards. We have more comments about Henry being a teenager. My students always want to go back to Crane's universe and War is Kind poems to try to understand Henry. Um, and then Rashida writes, Nelson, you're right. He's lucky to be alive. He's naive. I wonder what my students will think of him since they have studied the war in history class. And
Yeah.
Jody has, she has a visual right now. That would be a wonderful thing to see. Instead of his blue kepi, his blue Union cap, red hunting cap. Uh, yeah, that's a great image. So this, I tell you, this webinar has made me rethink Red Badge. I always kind of dismissed Henry, but I see him now as a deeper character than I had thought.
This is great. This has been great. I've really
Yeah.
enjoyed it.
So did we? Let's what do we think? What do our participants think? We've talked about Henry. We're not. He's kind of a hero. He wants to be one, but he's kind of a hero in spite of himself. He was just instinctively thrown into heroism, perhaps. But what do we think about Crane? We haven't heard from our participants. Do our participants think Crane believes in heroism? Because he's mocked Henry throughout. How about that? Let's see, one more question slipped in on your folks here. Does Crane believe in heroism? We have a number of people typing in. Let's see what they have to say. And Eliza, you said you think Crane does believe in heroism.
Yeah, in the open boat and some
Mm-hmm.
of his other stories, there are people who behave with extraordinary uh, care towards others and are
Mm-hmm.
sacrifice themselves for others. So I think here the acuteness of his portrayal. To me, Henry is not a hero by the
Mm-hmm.
end. I don't think Crane is exactly judging that, but the acuteness with which Crane portrays someone who is not a hero to me, shows that he knows what he thinks a hero is. He's presenting
Uh-huh.
a study in what a hero is not, and
Uh-huh.
that helps us. I would think that that suggests that he has a strong idea of what a hero should be.
Right,
Um,
right. So
and
Jody
and
writes, I think
showing
so.
what a hero isn't.
hmm Maggie was depicted at times, as heroic in his first book. I think the verdict is out on Henry. He does seem heroic in the follow-up story, The
He
Veteran.
does seem more heroic
And
in the veteran. That's true.
okay, I believe that Crane just wants people to do what we're doing right now. We need to question what a hero means from all points of view. I think Crane
That's
does
a great
believe in
point.
heroism. As other characters exhibit heroism, it's more interesting to create a flawed character in Henry, perhaps to point out false heroes. And Ryan, I think Crane is conveying the complexity of the human experience in the First Industrial War. Excellent point. And if you have the ability to fight for the soldier to your right and left, if you can stare death in the face and not run, maybe Henry is a hero. That, I think, brings our program to an excellent conclusion. I think we'll give Ryan the last word there. Unless people have some other questions or comments, I see we have some people yet typing. Let's hang on before we wrap things up and see what folks are going to say. In the meantime, Eliza, let me thank you very much. This has been a great webinar, and as I said,
Pleasure.
you've
It's been a
given me new
pleasure.
insights into this. I hope our participants got new insights as well.
Thank you
Um,
all. It was a pleasure to talk with you. I really enjoyed it.
okay, and I want to thank our participants. You really participated beautifully. Lots of good comments, lots of energy and enthusiasm. Thank you very much. See, I told you, the more you participate, the better the webinars are, and you participated a great deal, and this has been one of our finest ones. Please sign up for the next two in our series. January 28th, All Quiet on the Western Front. February 4th, The Things They Carried. And don't forget to submit your evaluations, and we'll get the documentation of participation to you right away. Those of you on the East Coast, stay out of the snow. We're expecting about 5 inches here in Chapel Hill, and that means that no work tomorrow. We'll just stay at home and watch the snow and stay warm. In the meantime, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your participation, and good evening.
Good night.